Case 8. Reynold explains boards, then invests. Well, the co-founders had formed their company via LegalZoom for about $149, naming themselves, plus Norm's mom, as the 3 initial board members. Their reasoning was simple. As far as they could tell, the only role of the board comprised signing documents mailed to them by LegalZoom. And Mom was always nearby with her auto-signer robot, meaning her signature was close at hand.
Okay, so you formed a C corporation on LegalZoom, off to a good start there. Most of my clients haven't even incorporated yet when they see me. But who's on your board?
We didn't really know what a board would do at CPR, so we kept it in the family. Just the 3 of us, Tiff and Mom and me. But what should we do different?
Well, in the family is good. Always better to keep it easy at the beginning. Later, you'll have outsiders on your board, and that's a whole different ballgame. Let's take a minute to talk through the rationale of having a board, and then we can think about the right members. Think of the CEO as the quarterback. He or she is throwing the football every day as head of the company. But there has to be a coach and or a general manager who is a backstop to the quarterback, their supervisor or boss. Well, the entity ultimately responsible if anything goes really wrong, yeah, that's who they are. And yes, they take a ton of credit and money when things go really right.
So what goes wrong? What goes right? Like, what do you mean?
Well, that's where the board comes in, ultimately responsible for the company's success or failure in one form or another. The board is the governor. In legal terms, the board has the ultimate fiduciary duty to the company's shareholders, who they work for, to deliver optimal investment returns.
What is optimal?
Well, it just means the best they can do. No set financial return here or standard. But as a board member, you're obligated to act in the best interests of the shareholder at all times. So in the same way that the board is the CEO's boss, well, the shareholders, meaning those who invested money into the company, they are the board's boss.
But we are the shareholders, so we're our own boss?
Well, yeah, in effect. You'll hear the top guys on Sand Hill Road say, the money is the boss. It's almost like a mantra, the yoga thing.
While Mom was a lovely person, she, added little value here. And now that Norman and Tiff understood the role of the board, at least a bit better, it was obvious that her seat needed to be changed. Well, since the biggest initial challenge was simply to get the product to work, Professor Plum was a fairly obvious candidate, and he was all too happy to receive 0.5% of the company in stock options. The company had been formed with 8 million shares, 4 million for Tiff, 4 million for Norm, so 0.5% was 40,000 options. Well, Plum was pushy, so they let him take his grant fully vested rather than subject to the 1-year cliff and 4-year vest provisions that employees usually had in their grants. And of course, Plum chuffed away about how great his Rolodex was and how helpful he'd end up being.
I know all the guys on Sand Hill Road. I would be a huge value add for you guys. And not to mention, any VC firm would be nervous to see a board with 2 members of the same family.
Well, Tiff chimed in.
So why are we doing this? Like the incorporation and the board and all the formality. We don't even have a product yet.
Great questions. But first, before we get to the board, why would you incorporate? Well, there are a few key reasons, and they all relate to what would happen if you didn't incorporate. Well, if you didn't incorporate, then you two would just be doing this project as individuals, and we can think of a few problems with that.
But we totally trust each other. I'm fine with whatever.
Well, yes, today, but you never know what the future brings. So the first issue is about ownership. These robots you're building are unique and valuable. Lawyers would call them intellectual property or IP. But who owns that IP? Do you each own half of it? Do you own it together like, husband and wife? What would happen if you disagreed and each thought you had played a bigger role in creating the IP? Who would be right? Well, when you incorporate, you avoid these issues and make clear that the company owns the IP, not you, the individuals.
So I guess that matters if you, take money from outside investors then, right?
Right, exactly. And so the second issue is about fundraising. You'll need money to pay salaries and buy Lego pieces and rent an office, but how will you get that money? Well, investors will give you that money in return for shares of the company that you incorporated. And the investors will need to be confident that you're selling them shares of the company that actually owns the IP we just talked about.
I get that. Or at least I can spell IP.
Well, good. The third reason for incorporating is about limiting liability. Corporate entity shields you from personal liability. That way, if the robots get loose and, attack Tokyo, you personally don't get sued. Corporation itself likely goes bankrupt, but, then personally, it don't.
But we have no money anyway.
Well, yes, but you will someday, and that's why the protection of corporate structure matters. It's called limited liability. Both corporations and LLCs, limited liability corporations, have it, and that's a good thing. Your liability is more or less limited then to the assets of the business that you're running. Well, you'll have directors and officers insurance at some point, and you don't really need it right now. What you should be focused on here is control of the company. Someday, if things go well, you'll wake up and realize that you no longer control your own company, the one you guys will have built here from the ground up.
We'd lose control? How? How could that happen?
Well, because you're going to sell off little pieces of ownership or equity along the way to other investors who all want a slice of your robot pie, and eventually those investors will own more than you do.
Well, why can't we control it? Isn't there stuff we can do so we never lose control?
Well, yes, it's called super voting stock, and it is done, but it's rare. And it usually only gets granted in extremely hot companies, in extremely hot investment climate. Your situation just, doesn't really fit those parameters. You're new to the game, so even if you asked for it, I doubt any investor would agree to it.
So what do we do?
Well, you just trust in the process and the people you bring onto the board. If you execute, you'll make so much money building this company, I doubt you'll care all that much about the control part. As you grow the company, you'll raise money from venture capitalists. That money comes in the form of preferred stock.
Don't we own common stock? What's the difference?
Right. Two big differences. First, preferred stock doesn't vote for board seats. The venture capitalists usually have to separately state in their investment documents that a seat or two on the board will be held in reserve for them as long as they own, say, 15% of the fully diluted common shares outstanding of the company in which they have invested. This doesn't matter for you yet, but in a public company, for the most part, virtually all of the shares are common, and it's those shares which vote and elect you. Well, the other big difference is that preferred stock is superior to common stock. It gets paid back first in a bad outcome, and sometimes even in a good outcome.
So why do the venture people get a superior form of class?
And then Plum began to show his real self more clearly as he intoned,
Class is the right word here. There is a class war in America. You will find it soon enough in your young professional lives.
Yeah, there's a pretty straightforward reason here. From the VC's perspective, they are fronting the financial capital here. And more than half the time when they first invest, they barely understand what the company actually even does for a living. So if the founders ever, say, walked away and started a new company, well, the venture capitalists would have essentially nothing left from the few $1 million they just invested. So they sort of demand and get a superior class of stock. And depending on how the negotiation works out, preferred stock comes in really two flavors, participating and non-participating. Both flavors ensure that the VC investor gets its money back first in a bad outcome, where the company is sold cheap or goes into bankruptcy. Most good companies that are successful at raising money sell non-participating preferred shares. That milder flavor requires the investor to choose between getting their money back first or sharing in the proceeds pro rata, meaning equally, with the common shareholders. Well, in a bad situation, they choose to get their money back first, but in a good outcome, they make a much bigger return by receiving their pro rata share of shares. See what I did there?
What's the other one called?
Well, the other flavor is called participating preferred. Companies only sell participating preferred shares when they are desperate. The deal is much sharper. These investors get their money back first and get to share in the remaining proceeds pro rata with the common shareholders. Well, in a bad outcome, this might not be a big deal, but in a good situation, they get to, well, basically double dip. Companies that are really struggling or fundraising in a tough market sometimes end up selling participating preferred with a multiple, meaning that the investors get 2 or 3 times their money back first and then get to share in the remaining proceeds pro rata.
Example?
Sure. Well, let's do a simple non-participating preferred example because, well, that's the flavor we'll get. You get a venture capitalist to put in, say, $3 million into CPR, and it gets sold for $4 million. Well, then they get back all of their $3 million before you common shareholders get a dime. The $1 million then left over is split among all of the common shareholders, and I'm way oversimplifying how things work here. But on the other hand, the same situation with participating preferred, they get their money back and then they get to take their percentage of the remaining $1 million as well. Right? So if they owned a third when they invested, they then get $333,000 or so back after that. Well, there are tons of twists and turns along the way that complicate things. Not worth worrying about today until you have a term sheet.
Okay, so for now, Norm's mom is going off the board. We sign. And Professor Plum is coming on the board, which will then be just the 3 of us.
Well, Professor, if you'd like to buy out and own your options, we can take care of that. It'll cost you 1/100 of a cent a share.
I think I can afford that, even on a professor's salary. We don't get options. But I'll take a $4 lottery ticket. Why not?
Well, the room went silent as the reductive, almost insulting words fell heavy and real. Reynold could relate to the angst of being surrounded by such great wealth as he lived only in its shadow as a servant to it. Well, he had pushed hard to secure his firm's permission to accept part of his legal fees in stock options from his early-stage clients. Well, that simply wasn't how the firm's business model worked, and he understood this to mean that the senior partners wanted all the cash to flow up to them, while he and others were, well, really, quote, partners, unquote, in name only, essentially just highly paid salaried workers whose hours were counted religiously. Well, after much arguing, the senior partners had eventually agreed that if Reynold obtained the appropriate waivers, he could invest his own money in clients. Well, seeing robotics expert Professor Plum excitedly buy out his options encouraged Reynold to take action.
So, what do we do now?
Well, Reynold and Plum said almost simultaneously, "You raise money." And they were off. As Plum walked out the door, Reynold turned to Norm.
I love working with you two. And I'd be really honored if I could invest in your first round. Would $50,000 be okay?
Well, Norm and Tiff looked at each other and shrugged. They vaguely understood that having some skin in the game would make Reynold even more responsive to their weekend and evening emails, so they nodded, and all of them went back to work.